I would start by saying, do not marry your manuscript until you're ready to turn it in. A lot of times I find writers, they write one or two drafts and it's really hard for them to cut anything out. And they may have to, sometimes you have to cut as much as half of the manuscript. So I just say stay detached, not too involved with your own manuscript. Be willing to cut anything, whatever it takes to make the story work. So that's kind of the umbrella above all the editing. One thing I would say is for fiction writers especially, read your dialogue out loud. A lot of people don't. They just write it and then they go with it. But when we read books, when we read dialogue, even though we're reading with our eyes, we're listening with our inner ear, and that gives us our imagination, the picture of the character, how they talk and so forth. So if we read the dialogue out loud, we'll know immediately, instantly, if something doesn't sound right, and then you make the change that way. It's much better than trying to just do it visually. Another one is to use action verbs. If a noun is the driver of the sentence or driver of the car, the action verb is its engine. It drives the sentence. It drives the action. It brings us into the story. And a lot of times I see with writers, they use a lot of passive language, especially the more tired they get when they get later into writing their book. It's just easier. We all learned how to write passively, the to be verbs and stuff. We all learned to write like that in school. We revert to it. We default to it. But using action verbs really drives the story and engages the reader. Another thing is, instead of saying "I felt like," I felt sad, try something like "her shoulders slumped." Visually show emotions. That's another one. It's a finer point, but it really separates one level of writer from another. The writers that can get past that and actually show the emotion, because when we're writing books, especially fiction and narrative nonfiction such as memoir and biographies, we really want to show how the characters or the subjects look. Another thing is to make sure that all of the every line and every paragraph of the book is in proper sequence. It's called sequencing, and it's something that we think when we're writing our first draft and so forth, that the novel is, or the book is good when we're writing it, but then you go back to it, say a month later after you give yourself a month off, look at it again and things might seem to be out of order. So it's really important to make sure everything is sequenced right so it flows seamlessly, one scene leads to another, and even within paragraphs to make sure each sentence in the paragraph is sequenced properly. These are the main things, but one other thing I would say is to make sure when you're writing fiction that the characters are consistent throughout. For instance, if you have someone who's from the South, then you don't want them to talk in Hawaiian Pidgin. And you'd be amazed at how often that happens. Or if you have, 5-6 characters in a book, you don't want them all to talk like yourself. Or, you don't want them to all have your same exact traits. So distinguish and differentiate the characters, but make sure you stay consistent with that throughout the book.
Now, if you want to revise your manuscript yourself, and I do recommend that because working with an editor is not cheap, but it is worthwhile. But if you want to revise your manuscript yourself, my first recommendation would be this. After you finished a draft, don't go right back to the manuscript and go back to page 1 and fix it, but put it away. Seriously, put it away. While you're putting it away, read other people's work, but don't read it passively, read it actively. Use flags. Flags are my favorite tool of the trade. Read books and flag other people's books and flag the sections that you enjoyed, that you liked. I don't care if it's a particular word or a metaphor or a particular scene or just a character that struck you, or that created empathy for you. Flag those sections that somehow created a positive emotional reaction from you, and look at them later and see what the writer did, to create that reaction. Once you've read a couple of people's materials, that really struck you, then you can go back to your own material and do the same thing with your book. Read your book and flag the things you liked. Don't look for issues right away. There's no reason. You need to once in a while be reminded what you did well. So flag things that really worked for you. Again, it doesn't matter why you liked it. It can be as simple as, oh, I love that word, or as complex as, wow, that scene just works perfectly for whatever I wanted to say. So flag those things in a particular color, because those are the things you will keep. Those are like the base layer of your manuscript that will not change because you like them. And then after you've done that first positive read-through, you need to read the manuscript again, 3 more times, corresponding to those 3 levels of readability before you make the first revision. Again, flag, use flags, use Post-it notes to flag your manuscript. First, look for content issues. Second, look for style, voice, and scene issues. Make comments on those flags that you're using, such as, oh, that scene is unnecessary, cut. Or make comments such as, that scene is too long, needs to be tightened. Or make comments such as, this dialogue is so boring, all it does is give information. Or add subtext or whatever comment you want to make. In your third read-through, look for those last issues, like commas and periods that are missing, and grammatical structures that don't quite work, or sentences that are too complicated. And once you have done that, once you have that tremendously colorful manuscript with all those different flags on it, then you go back and start revising, following the individual flags. It'll make it far, far easier for you to not get lost in itty-bitty corrections when really what you need to do in your first revision is to look at the bigger picture.
So self-editing a manuscript is an interesting question, because it comes down to the question of what kind of editing you want to do when you consider self-editing. My personal process is to copy edit, for instance, as I go. If I'm working on 1 or more projects, and sometimes I have to switch back and forth between them, the first thing I do when I sit down to work on something is read the last chapter, or what I wrote the day before, or however much I can make the time to read. As part of doing that, you do the basic copy editing. You'll notice if you made a weird typo, if you used the wrong name, or little simple things like that. So there's a great deal of writing advice out there that says don't edit until you've finished your first draft, but copy editing isn't really that kind of editing. It's also very useful for getting yourself back in the flow of what you were working on. For larger structural editing, I would say you want to wait until the end, or until it's very, very obvious that something is broken. If you're concerned about the structure of the book that you're writing, so for instance, you've been writing for a few weeks, you feel like maybe you're at halfway, and the end is only getting further away, then maybe it's time to take a pause and sketch out an outline and say, where did I go wrong that I don't know where to go next? If you're worried about mid-level things like character interactions, or does this scene, for instance, if you say, I need this scene, I know I need this scene, but I don't know if it belongs here, then make yourself a note and keep going. One of 2 things will happen. You'll either realize later in the book that it needs to be there instead of where you put it the first time, and you can change it, or you'll get to the end, and that may be a clue that you didn't need to worry about it in the first place. The larger issue of larger editing is very easy to think about. It's much easier to edit something that's finished. So if you're doing any kind of structural editing, anything that's developmental, or a more rigorous line edit, or something to say, not are the words right on the page, but is the story or the book structured correctly, wait until the end for that. It's to make another Carpenter reference, you can work from your plans or you can wing it. But if you wing it, your bookcase is going to lean. So work from your plans, get to the end, and then do the big structural rewrites if necessary. So tools for editing is kind of a Pandora's box. It's a question of, again, what kind of editing that you're doing and whether you feel the tools are going to be useful. The one that most everyone uses is the spell checker in Microsoft Word and the grammar checker in Microsoft Word. The spell checker and the grammar checker are very, very smart, very, very dumb machines. They catch everything, even if you intend it to be that way. So I've worked with a lot of writers over the years who said, I don't need this book to be edited. I just ran the spell check and accepted all the changes. And I tell them, you should probably go back and read that book again to make sure. The automated tools the basic automated tools like those that come in word processors are very good at catching typos. They're very bad at grammar. They're very bad at sentence fragments. They're very bad at what we generally consider style. If you choose to write with a lot of single paragraph sentences, that confuses Word very much. If you like to use a lot of em dashes, that confuses Word very much. For larger issues, though, there are a couple what I guess would be called third-party tools, things like Grammarly and tools like that are a bit more rigorous and a bit more programmable, that are useful if you're using them for the right things. It's important whenever you're looking at any tool for writing to understand before you start what its limitations are. I think that's the greatest danger that most writers fall into.
There are a lot of common editing mistakes that authors make, especially first-time authors. One of the things that I find very upsetting is that people seem to be losing a grasp of basic grammar, and they mix up things like the use of words like that and which, thinking that which is much more hoity-toity sounding, and there really is a distinct usage for both of those terms. So it's that kind of thing, or people mix up it's possessive and it is contraction. They mix that up quite a bit. That sort of thing. So just basic grammar, and so any author who can refresh him or herself on grammar will improve their manuscript greatly. Another thing they do a lot is adverbs, overuse of adverbs. I believe Stephen King in his book On Writing said, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs." And you know, when you think about it, he's absolutely correct. Especially words like really, very, words like that can often be removed, and they're punchier without those words being in that because they lose their effect because they're used so commonly. So watching the amount of adverbs in your book is also a really good thing to do. So between grammar, adverbs, those are just two basic tips.
Well, it's hard to edit your own work. I send out my articles and have someone look them over because I miss things too, but there are a few things you can do. Again, you want to look through, make sure that you are showing instead of telling. You want to make sure that your character voices are very distinctive. When you go through your lines of dialogue, if you have what you want your characters to say, go back and rewrite what they're going to say so that it reflects their distinctive personalities and voices. Obviously, you want to have a handle on grammar. And again, hire a freelance editor if you'd like. It really is a wonderful way to get your manuscript in good shape. I think just knowing the basic rules and going through and being able to, it's difficult because you have to stand back and take that emotion out. Because again, as I said, it's your baby and it's very hard to make changes yourself. But going through and just doing basic grammar, making sure you're showing versus telling, and just making sure there's not a lot of repetition, things like that, you can do yourself. But I really am a proponent of getting a writer's group, someone to critique it, because it's just so hard to find flaws in your own writing, because of course it's wonderful. You wrote it.